The village was restless, buzzing with whispers and mocking glances. Right in the heart of it all, there was her husband, a man the villagers saw as weak, crippled, and a burden. But there she stood, unwavering, watching as he moved forward with purpose no one expected. In the murmur of ridicule, she saw something they couldn't, a quiet, fierce determination in his eyes. He might be slow, but every step he took was resolute, as if he was on a mission. And then, as he took a breath and lifted his gaze to the crowd, everyone held theirs. Without explanation, his actions began to defy all expectations. It wasn't what he said, but what he did next that left the entire village speechless. The sun was setting behind the dusty village walls, casting long shadows on the worn cobblestone paths. The air was thick with the hum of gossip, but amidst it all, she stood beside him. The villagers whispered in hushed tones, not realizing she could hear every word. Her husband, once strong, now a shell of his former self, had been reduced to nothing more than a target for their mockery. His crippled leg made every step a struggle, each movement a reminder of what he'd lost. But there was something about the way he looked at the crowd, his eyes steely, unblinking, that made them uneasy. Around them, life went on. Children laughed and ran past. The smell of fresh bread wafted from the bakery. But inside her, the storm was rising. She couldn't let them tear him down. Not like this. The village chief's son stood tall among them, laughing the loudest. His voice echoed through the marketplace, taunting her husband. She clenched her fists, but her gaze stayed locked on her husband. What he was about to do would change everything. The tension in the air was palpable. The villagers' cruel laughter echoed, and with every passing second, her husband seemed to shrink further into himself. The village chief's son stepped forward, sneering at the crippled man, as if his disability were a joke. The crowd's mocking words cut deep, but she refused to look away. Her heart pounded in her chest. The stakes were clear. If her husband didn't act now, they would never respect him again. He would remain nothing more than the village's punching bag, an object of scorn. Her throat tightened as she glanced at his expression. It wasn't one of defeat. It was one of quiet fury. With a sudden movement, her husband pushed himself to his feet. He winced, his leg clearly in pain, but he stood tall. The crowd fell silent, the mockery fading. She could feel the weight of the moment. Her husband had made his choice. Would he prove them wrong? Would he show the village that he was more than just the crippled man they saw? Or would he break under the pressure, just as they expected? The air thickened. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then he moved. The air was thick with tension. Every eye in the village was on him as he stood there, vulnerable. The villagers' laughter rang in his ears, cutting deeper than any physical wound could. She could see the anger building inside him, the frustration of years of ridicule. But he wasn't reacting. He was calculating, waiting for the right moment. Without warning, he moved. It was swift, deliberate, one step, then another. His body stiffened, but he pushed forward, despite the limp that had always defined him. Every step echoed like a challenge to the crowd. They watched, stunned, unsure of what to do. Her heart raced. This was no longer about his disability. It was about his defiance. Suddenly, the villagers fell silent. Even the chief's son, who had been leading the mockery, froze in place. Then, with a force she didn't know he had, he threw something into the air. It glinted in the sunlight before crashing to the ground. The entire village gasped. What had once been seen as a weakness, the very thing they had mocked, was now his strength. The moment hung in the air. The twist was real. The man who had been pushed to the margins now stood at the center of attention, holding the power he had hidden for so long. She knew, with a rush of disbelief, that the game had changed. The crowd was silent, every eye fixed on him as he stood there, the weight of their laughter heavy in the air. She could feel the sharpness of their judgment, their cruel words hanging in the wind. But there was something different now, something in his eyes that wasn't there before. He wasn't defeated, he was ready to show them what they never expected. As the chief's son taunted him again, he took a slow step forward. It was a small, subtle move, but it was enough. Then another and another. Each step was measured, precise. The villagers shifted, murmurs rising, unsure of what was happening. She watched, breath held, her heart pounding. Without warning, he reached into his coat and pulled out an object, a gleaming, sharp blade. The villagers gasped, taking a collective step back. But this wasn't the twist they expected. He didn't threaten anyone with it. He didn't swing it in anger. Instead, he used it to cut the ropes that bound his legs, the ones they'd all believed had kept him crippled. With a snap, the ropes fell, and for the first time in years, he stood tall, no longer dependent on anyone, no longer the target of their mockery. The villagers were stunned. The chief's son, who had mocked him the most, stood frozen, his sneer fading into disbelief. The twist was sudden and shocking. What they had seen as weakness was, in reality, the strength that had been waiting to break free. The crippled man had never needed anyone's pity. He only needed the right moment to prove his worth. And now, in that moment, he had done the unthinkable. The dust settled. The crowd stood still, a mix of awe and disbelief hanging in the air. She could hardly believe her eyes as he stood fully upright, no longer the helpless man they had ridiculed for so long. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, the weight of his victory now palpable. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that fills the space between realization and acceptance. Then, a single voice broke through, hesitant at first, but then stronger. We were wrong. It wasn't just one voice. Slowly, murmurs rippled through the crowd, a collective acknowledgement of their mistake. The chief's son, who had mocked him the most, lowered his head in shame, unable to meet the now unwavering gaze of the man he had once scorned. She watched as the man walked toward her, his steps measured but confident. Without a word, he took her hand, and together, they faced the stunned villagers. The moment was still electric, but it was clear. Their world had shifted. What they thought they knew about him, about strength, had just been turned on its head. The man didn't need to say a word. His actions had already spoken louder than any insult ever could. And as the last of the villagers began to disperse, the shadows of judgment lifting, he turned to her with a quiet, satisfied smile. They had won. Not just the battle, but the freedom to live on their own terms. And with that, the story ended, but the lesson lingered. Never judge a person by their weaknesses. For it's often in those moments that true strength is forged. The crowd finally dispersed, the tension easing, but the story wasn't quite over. The air was thick with the weight of what had just transpired. As the villagers began to return to their homes, a strange stillness remained, a deep reflection of the past and the unexpected truths that had just unfolded. She stood there with him, their hands still intertwined, the quiet satisfaction of victory settling between them. But something else lingered in the air, a question almost unspoken. How often do we overlook the hidden strength of those around us, too quick to judge based on what we see on the surface? The chief's son, still reeling from the shock, walked past them in silence, no words left to say. His guilt was his alone now. But could he ever change his views on the disabled, the weak, the different? Or would he forever be haunted by this moment? The quiet yet powerful question lingered. What happens when the underestimated rise up? And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the village, it was clear that this moment would never be forgotten. It would linger in their minds, leaving them to reflect on their own judgments and perhaps reconsider their view of others. So, the story ends here, but the question remains. Have you ever misjudged someone based on what you thought you knew? Share your thoughts below.